and I'm a lecturer in medical anthropology and ethnobotany at the University of Kent. And so, just for those of you who aren't completely sure, anthropology is the study of people, and it's a very, very big field. It's the study of people everywhere in the world and throughout all of time. So, as you can imagine, it's a pretty big field, and we tend to specialize. So that's why I'm a medical anthropologist, which narrows things down a little bit because I'm interested in things about people everywhere throughout all of time, but particularly as it relates to their health and well-being and medicine and healing and other medically related things like that, which is still very, very broad. So I guess the ethnobotany kind of helps me narrow things down even further, and for those of you who aren't sure, ethnobotany is the relationship between people and plants. So my work as a medical anthropologist and ethnobotanist focuses on how people use plants and some other substances too in healing. And my experience has been with working with people and looking at how they use herbal medicines in particular as both a form of healing but also as a form of resistance against the sort of dominant medical paradigm that I'm not really going to go into too much today. And that brought me to working with one very particularly interesting medicinal plant, and that is cannabis, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm here. But also one of the reasons why I'm here is because I was one of the co-organizers of Breaking Convention, so I do that as well, in addition to my... So some of you, I guess, were there. Well, I know some of you were there, and I guess the rest of you have heard about it. And yeah, so since Breaking Convention took place in April, I've been kind of getting some new research projects started. Again, still going on the sort of medical cannabis theme, but now in addition to my interests in sort of its use in self-medication, I've also hooked up with some official medical marijuana patients in the United States and in the Netherlands. And that's been quite interesting. And then the other direction that my work has been going is doing a bit of work among Rastafari. And so drug policy is not my area of expertise, but of course it's something that is important to my work because it does impact on my work, both in terms of finding people who will talk openly about using cannabis and other illicit drugs as medicines, but also in my ability to perform the work in the first place. Since Breaking Convention, I've also been asked a lot about what I think about the post-prohibition world and what that might be and what we should do. Should we legalize? Should we decriminalize? Blah, 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 blah. And I tend to actually shy away from those questions. And the reason why is because I'm sort of caught between, on one side, looking at questions of individual freedom, particularly cognitive freedom, but also sort of medical freedom, or you might call it, the freedom to choose other modes of healing other than just the sort of mainstream mode of healing. And looking at those sorts of questions where, you might say the logical conclusion is, yes, just legalize everything and let people sort it out for themselves. But then there's also the other side where realistically we're living on a relatively small planet and there are billions and billions of us, and it's kind of hard to just make these big changes and leave people to get on with it. And there needs to be some sort of regulation, and maybe organization is a better way of thinking about it. So I kind of lean a bit towards the side of individual freedom, and I don't know if I need a chiropractor or something to rebalance me, but what I'm hoping to do today, and in preparing for this and thinking about it, I think taking a brief anthropological look at the pre-prohibition world, and also my sort of insights on the prohibition world, will help me kind of make some reasonable recommendations then for the post-prohibition world. So as an anthropologist, interested in people in all places and all time, we got to go back. And to get to the pre-Prohibition world, we have to go back further than you might think. Because although the current manifestation of prohibition that we're sort of talking about today, and these international conventions on drugs, and the Misuse of Drugs Act, and other sort of national laws, these are just the current manifestations of a very, very long history of prohibition. And so, I would put prohibition as starting, maybe 1500, a couple thousand years ago. So very, very briefly, okay, doing okay on time, I guess. The pre-prohibition world. So really, that would have been back before we started getting really big cities on this planet, really big city-states, for sure, on this planet. So, we're going back quite a long ways. So before we had cities and states and urbanization, and now this is, well, people put it between 90 and 95% of human history, we lived in societies that consisted of, relatively small family group, extended family group networks. And so people, before we started building cities and states, tended to live in groups of maybe in the hundreds range. And sometimes quite smaller. And of course, the total global population of humans up until relatively recently was also quite small, up until things started to change when we started to urbanize. So we've got people living in small populations, where you have face-to-face relationships with everybody in your society, in your social group, one way or another. And perhaps you might even be related to them through blood or through marriage. There was also a lot of ecological diversity, like humans, we've been spreading all over the planet for hundreds of thousands of years. And so, as you might imagine, human societies around the equator in sub-Saharan Africa are quite different than the human societies that developed, say on this island or on other parts of the world. And we're a very, very adaptable species, and we can figure out how to make a living in some really, really amazing parts of the world. And there are people who even sustain their livelihoods living on oil rigs built out in the ocean. That's how adaptable we are. So there was a lot of diversity among humans. But there appears to be, from everything we know, and I should just sort of preface that a lot of what we know is based on archaeological evidence. Some of it's based on looking at non-urbanized and non-state level societies. There are still a few that kind of maybe sort of exist around, and a lot of it's speculation. But from what we know, there was a sort of what you might call spiritual ubiquity during this time, where members of different societies, different societal groups would often, share some knowledge of, discussion of, the other worlds, other planes of existence. You get the development of things like shamanism, which I'm going to guess most of you have at least heard the term, and so I don't really need to go into what that is, but it's basically, these are types of, I would hesitate to call them religions, but sort of systems of spiritual understanding about the forces of nature and things like that. There was a lot more what I've called economic balance, in the sense that the way people made their living doesn't seem to have sort of bled the land dry and stripped it of all its natural resources the way we kind of live our lives now. And health, again, this is my area of expertise. There's a lot of evidence out there in the archaeological record of populations having a dramatic decline in health when you start getting farming, and you start getting cities, and you start getting urbanization and the development of states. So relatively speaking, people were probably a lot healthier in the pre-Prohibition world way, way, way back when. The other thing we know that I think someone mentioned this morning is that this pre-Prohibition world was chock full of psychoactive substances, and again, as we talked about this morning, of all different sorts and types and ranges. So they were really relatively widely distributed, and there were a lot of adaptive benefits, it seemed, from consuming them. And I'm not going to go into the details of all of that, but suffice it to say that when you look at it from a sort of a chemical ecology perspective and an evolutionary perspective, there were no doubt a lot of adaptive benefits of people taking certain psychoactive substances that mimic neurotransmitters, which are nutritionally very costly for the body to produce. So people were taking drugs for a very, very long time. And people also practiced, I mentioned shamanism, which is, of course, a system both of sort of spirituality, but also of healing goes along with that. But there was also what we might call domestic medicine. So, it was the family unit where medicine was practiced. Mothers, and indeed this is still true in most of the world today, mothers took the responsibility of caring for their young, caring for, the other adults in their extended family networks. People looked after each other, people treated themselves, people experimented things. Sometimes people went to the shaman if they were really, sick and something was seriously wrong, but there was a lot of domestic medicine happening. Then, fast forwarding a little bit, we get the Prohibition world, which really, as I said, started with the development of the state and the development of organized religions as well. They kind of went hand in hand, and the relationship goes back a couple thousand years at least. So all over in different parts of the world, and this didn't happen at the same time everywhere. It happened first in the Fertile Crescent, and then it happened later in Mesoamerica, and even later in sub-Saharan Africa. But it started happening over a period of several thousand years all over the world, that people started settling down, populations started growing, you start getting monumental architecture, and you start getting organized governments, both of spiritual life and productive life as well. So you get, my area of the world that I've studied is Mesoamerica. And so going back to the classic Maya period or even the Aztecs, there's very clear evidence that they continued to use these psychoactive substances, but who was allowed to use them started to change, and they started to be concentrated in the hands of the priestly rulers, and the common people were prohibited. And they had different ways of enforcing that prohibition back then and in that part of the world than we have now, but they were still no doubt very effective. So you get these socioeconomic hierarchies and also socio-spiritual hierarchies as well. And what this leads into is the state control of consciousness, both consciousness and production. And then this was, fast forwarding again a little bit more, expanded throughout the world through conquest and colonization and slavery. So then we end up with the current manifestation where we have these globalized treaties, these single conventions that every nation in the world is expected to follow. Well, that human diversity that I mentioned early on, it didn't go away. We're still very diverse, even though there's a whole lot more of us and we bump up against each other more. And then we have this phenomenon where this is all seems to be becoming secularized. So now it's not even run by organized religions, but now it's run by corporations that have just no soul at all, or let alone even a human face, many of them. So we've got globalization, a globalized or an increasingly globalized consumption economy, where we're measured not by what we do, but by what we buy and what we consume. Industrialization, we're cocooned in the built environment for much of our lives. And we have the current war on drugs, and the combination of other psychedelic techniques as well that aren't even related to these substances. Okay. And as you know, this world is pretty unstable. And we have not only a lot of problems with drugs in society, but a lot of ecological problems with the environment, and a lot of financial problems. We have crises in our education system, in our healthcare system, and they're all related. They are all related. So what we need in the post-prohibition world, or what I would like to see in the post-prohibition world, is a return to some balance and some stability, because right now everything is out of control. And that, of course, is going to take organization, if not actual regulation and planning of how we're going to change things. So the first thing is we've got to figure out how to make this distinction between growing, processing, using, researching drugs on the individual level, which I think probably most, if not all of us in this room would agree is a fundamental human right, with the inevitable outcome of people wanting to grow and process and use and trade and research these substances for other people. And so, we all have the fundamental right to do it on our own, and perhaps for our children, make decisions for our children. But what about, for other people? So we need to sort of think about this and how to balance individual rights and the need to organize society. As an anthropologist, I would suggest that we look for some guidance from spiritual leaders who have experience with certain, what some people would call sacred medicines, other people would call Class A drugs, Class A illicit drugs, altered states of consciousness in general, and there are a number of organized religions that have traditions with these things, like Rastafari, like Santo Daime, and others. But then there are also individuals who aren't necessarily part of a formally recognized church or religious movement that are also just as knowledgeable and just as experienced. And we need to look to these people, because what I would want to see, again, as an anthropologist, is the promotion of people exploring altered states of consciousness, different types of drug use for different things, with the aim of finding peace and joy and fulfillment out of these experiences. But maybe that's just me. There are economic things to consider. What are the real ecological costs of producing different drugs? Things like LSD and MDMA may indeed be miracle cures that are very, very safe. But could we produce them without the industrial machine? Could they have been produced without the global capitalist system that we have in place that is causing prohibition and messing everything else up? And we have to really think about that.
Most can be grown.
Well, we need to think about it. Another thing. And then with things that can be grown, then there's another problem, like, okay, well, it's all well and good to grow fields of cannabis and use that, but what about something like peyote that's very endangered, grows in a very fragile, limited environment, etc. So basically, to summarize, drug prohibition, it's not an isolated phenomenon. It's connected to current global and ecological problems. I think that defining the post-prohibition world gives us a really good opportunity to take just not a hard look at how we deal with drugs and people who use drugs, but all of these other problems that it's connected to. And the best way from an anthropological, it may not be the most practical way, but the best way from an anthropological perspective is to really take this opportunity not just to reform the drug laws, but to reform the whole systems of how we produce not just drugs, but food, medicines, how these get defined, how they get traded, how they're just, different new systems of exchange, and things like that. And that's, yeah. And my experience has been with working with people and looking at how they use herbal medicines in particular as both a form of healing, but also as a form of resistance against the sort of dominant medical paradigm that I'm not really going to go into too much today. And that brought me to working with one very particularly interesting medicinal plant, and that is cannabis, related things like that, which is still very, very broad. So I guess the ethnobotany kind of helps me narrow things down even further, and for those of you who aren't sure, ethnobotany is the relationship between people and plants. So my work as a medical anthropologist and ethnobotanist focuses on how people use plants and some other substances too in healing. A very, very big field. It's the study of people everywhere in the world and throughout all of time. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty big field, and we tend to specialize, so that's why I'm a medical anthropologist, which narrows things down a little bit because I'm interested in things about people everywhere throughout all of time, but particularly as it relates to their health and well-being and medicine and healing and other medically Waldstein, and I'm a lecturer in medical anthropology and ethnobotany at the University of Kent. And so just for those of you who aren't completely sure, anthropology is the study of people, and it's which is, I think, one of the reasons why I'm here. But also one of the reasons why I'm here is because I was one of the co-organizers of Breaking Convention, so I do that as well, in addition to my So some of you, I guess, were there. Well, I know some of you were there, and I guess the rest of you have heard about it. And yeah, so since Breaking Convention took place in April, I've been